Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we're going to be covering the disappearance of Simone Ridinger, a young woman from Sherborn, Massachusetts who went missing from the nearby town of Natick back in 1977. I first began looking into her case a few months ago and came across some recent articles regarding the current investigation. During my research, I learned that the detective currently assigned to her case, Detective James Godinho, had participated in quite a few interviews regarding his investigation. So I reached out to see if he would be willing to speak with us about Simone, and he was. We ended up not only getting to speak with Detective Godinho, but he also included Detective Haswell from Natick, Massachusetts in our conversation as well. The two agencies have been working together recently, even though the case itself has been with Sherborn pretty much since the beginning.
As we were discussing Simone's case with the two detectives, we learned that Simone's sister, Betsy, had become more involved in their work over the past few years. So, we figured, what harm could come from asking them if they could put us in contact with her as well? And luckily, she was happy to reminisce about the good times she and her sister had together, while also explaining what things were like during the early days after Simone went missing.
We think, based on both interviews, you're going to have a good grasp not only of Simone's case and where the detectives are with their investigation, but you'll learn about who Simone was, the things she enjoyed, her life prior to her disappearance, and how this tragedy affected Betsy and her family. Now, because life happens, you'll be stuck with mostly just me today. But with that being said, let's dive in. Today's case is about the mysterious disappearance of Simone Ridinger. Simone was born on January 5th, 1960, to her parents, Jane and George. But when Simone was just a toddler, her father passed away, leaving her mother to care for her alone. Jane and Simone would go on to live in New York at some point after George's death and ended up living across the street from a father-daughter duo who also had their lives turned upside down by a death in the family. John Ridinger and his daughter Betsy had also lost a loved one. Betsy's mother had passed away, now leaving the two to look after each other. As time went on and Jane and John got to know each other and built a relationship together, John ended up adopting Simone and Jane adopted Betsy, bringing the two families together as one, bearing the Ridinger name. Betsy gave us a rundown of their early life when we spoke.
Well, actually, I was born in Pittsburgh, and I was adopted by John and Shirley Ridinger. And we moved to New York. And he was transferred. Mm-hmm. And the summer we moved there, I remember my father couldn't take a vacation because he had just gotten a promotion, starting a new job in New York. And we were just taking some long weekends. And one weekend, just before school started, I was going into the third grade, we went to Jones Beach. And my mother had a cerebral hemorrhage while we were in the water.
Oh, my goodness.
And so that was... obviously. Mm-hmm. Our next door neighbors were the Barretts, and they had their daughter and granddaughter living there. Mm-hmm. And my father met Jane, who was Simone's mother. Simone's father had been, I never met her father, George. Mm-hmm. He was gone time. And basically it was two widows, each with a child. And so they married, and Jane adopted me, and my dad adopted Simone. And I was 7, and she was 5 at the time.
Now that the two had become sisters, it was evident that they were total opposites. Simone being the free spirit who did whatever her heart desired, and Betsy being more of the disciplined rule follower of the two. As they grew older, they, of course, had their normal sisterly spats, but they loved each other nonetheless.
Well, because I didn't have a sister. I mean, she, mm-hmm. I was only child until then. And, I mean, we're completely different and we don't look at all alike. And though she looks just like our mother.
Mm-hmm,
so, but probably if we hadn't grown up together, we were so different. I don't think we would have probably even known each other.
Yeah.
Much, because we, different ages. I had a friend my age in the new neighborhood, and but in the same house. And then we were transferred again to Massachusetts, and and so that's how we became sisters. And the marriage wasn't really good, so when that was falling apart, we had each other, which was nice.
Betsy told us about how smart Simone was, and that by the time she was in kindergarten or first grade, she'd been attending what was known as French immersion school in New York. As a result, by 7 years old, she was already fluent in French. Unfortunately, though, when the family moved to Massachusetts sometime later, French immersion school wasn't an option there. So Simone had to give up her lessons, eventually losing her fluency of the language. At some point, the family landed their roots in Sherborn, Massachusetts, where they all lived together for quite some time. Betsy and Simone would go on to attend Dover Sherborn Regional High School, but as time went on, it became evident that school just wasn't Simone's thing. Like Betsy had mentioned before, her sister was super smart. The ability to do well in her studies wasn't the issue. She just wasn't a bookworm. She didn't want to be in class all day when she knew there were more fun or interesting things to do instead. Betsy actually told us a funny story regarding how she remembers Simone during her high school years.
She was going to get a GED. I mean, that was her plan, and she was working on it, but didn't get the chance. She just couldn't be bothered. I'd hear her name over the loudspeakers at school every day for detention because she didn't show up for something. And in our school, if you got one detention and didn't show, then it turned into 2. So every day, her name was, And someone would say, "You're calling your sister again." Yeah, I know.
That is too funny.
Deal with her, not me.
Yeah, you're like, all right, she can be the one in detention. I'm not going there.
Exactly. I mean, she was the one when she was in school, everybody knew her because she was friendly. You were her friend immediately, even before you knew her.
When we were chatting with Betsy, I could literally just picture that scenario in my head. Just like listening to the speaker, slumped in her desk chair, thinking, yep, there she goes again. What else is new? But like Betsy said, Simone always found better things to do. Some of her hobbies included horseback riding and music. The latter being one that she found herself to be very talented in. Betsy explained Simone's musical prowess, including singing, playing the piano and the guitar, and how she could practically pick up any instrument and play with no trouble at all.
Okay, yeah, because there was the horseback riding and then music, because she was talented. I took piano lessons. I don't know why, because I wasn't very good at it. And truly, 5 years, just nothing. But she started piano lessons a couple years after me, and our piano teacher actually had to change books, change the way she taught, because Simone remembered all the mistakes I made and was playing those. She was playing by ear.
Wow.
What she heard. She wasn't reading the music. She couldn't read the music. But she could do that, and so I gave up on piano, bought myself a guitar, and that was even worse, but she picked up my guitar, and away she went. Jane was the same way. You just sit her down at a keyboard, and she just sort of write a song. She sang beautifully, and both of them. Jane sang Gilbert and Sullivan theater, summer stuff, and took us to a lot of musical things. We went to the opera. We saw Pete Seeger on the Hudson River in his boat. I enjoyed it. I just couldn't play it.
Yep. Some people are there to listen.
That's me. I can listen, and I can, but I cannot play it. I can read the music, which is funny, but somewhere between my brain and my fingers, nothing happens. Simone could pick it up and just sing and dance and play any instrument, and really enjoyed it.
At some point, Betsy and Simone's parents, John and Jane, would split up. The family started to go their separate ways in regards to their living situations. John had moved out and was living in Holliston, Massachusetts, and then after Betsy had dabbled in living with roommates, she would settle on moving in with John when she began working for his business. And then sometime during early 1977, Simone moved into her own apartment in Framingham, Massachusetts that Jane had co-signed for her. Simone ended up dropping out of high school, but started the process of getting her GED after leaving. She also had a job as a waitress at a little diner known as the Rainbow Restaurant, located in Natick, Massachusetts, which she really enjoyed working at. Even though she was a free spirit, it seemed like she had some type of plan going forward, and things certainly seemed to be on the up and up. On Labor Day weekend, 1977, Simone had plans to head to Martha's Vineyard with her mother and her mother's new boyfriend. Jane and her new man would be heading there sometime before Simone, as she was scheduled to work at the Rainbow Restaurant on September 2nd, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. Simone's family owned a beach house on Martha's Vineyard that had been in the family for years, and back when John and Jane had been together and the kids were young, they would visit every summer. Betsy remembers fond memories of spending time at the beach house and told us all about it, and her explanation of their summers there will honestly make you feel like you're right there with her.
Well, it was up on a bluff, but it had a private beach. You could walk down to the beach. We could see over Edgartown Harbor.
Oh, okay.
You could see all the ships coming in.
Yep.
Yeah. And, just a 3-bedroom, one big room with kitchen, dining, and living room, and then 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. But you had kerosene lamps, candles.
Mm-hmm.
There was one gas lamp you put over the kitchen sink so people could wash dishes.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't just turn on the faucet for water. You had to start a pump to bring up the pressure. It was
wow.
rustic.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good way to describe it. Rustic.
Rustic living.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. But it was wonderful. We loved it. We were there, all summer. You had books. There were puzzles and games and, usually tons of cousins showing up. And the beach every morning when we were there for long periods, our mother would give us okay, this is the shell of the day. You have to go find it. And we'd have all day because basically you're thrown out of the house in the morning.
Yeah.
If it's sunny, go. And go to the beach. And nobody was watching us. And we'd spend all day hunting for the best one of that particular shell. See if we could get it. Or even just digging for clams. She'd give us the clamming license and we'd go out. We weren't fancy. We didn't use clamming rakes and things like that. Mm-hmm. It was our hands.
Yep.
And low tide, away you go. And, see what you could get. And we were on our own in the summer and we had a sail, sunfish. And our father taught us how to sail.
Mm-hmm.
And we could take the boat out. And, yeah.
Those just sound like such amazing childhood memories.
It was. That was really a great place to be. Yeah.
So on Friday, September 2nd, just a day before Simone planned to head to Martha's Vineyard to spend time with her mother and friends, she was working her typical waitressing shift at the Rainbow Restaurant. That same day, Betsy had a half day at work, which was a common occurrence every Friday at her job, and during this free time, she would come into the restaurant to visit her sister. Betsy knew about Simone's plans to head to Martha's Vineyard that weekend and that she planned to hitchhike to Hyannis, located in Cape Cod, to catch the ferry. Betsy offered to, at the very least, drop Simone off at the bus station so she didn't have to thumb her way there. But just based on everything we know about Simone already, she was the type of girl that would set her mind to something and do it her way. Her plan all along was to hitchhike from the Rainbow Restaurant in Natick all the way to Hyannis, which was over 80 miles or an hour and a half drive away. Of course, Betsy was concerned about her plans, as were Simone's peers, specifically the waitresses she worked with at the restaurant. But what everyone else thought about her plan didn't matter to her. Simone was set on her choice. We asked Betsy about her feelings on Simone's hitchhiking, her opinion on her doing so that weekend, and if anything seemed off with her sister before she left that day. Did anything seem out of the ordinary at all to you?
Nothing. Nope. She was her. Yeah. She was working. I mean, every time I'd go to order lunch, she'd yell out back to the, whoever's cooking, it's for my sister, bake it good, just that kind of thing. Yeah. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Even the girls, that Detective Godinho had spoken to, nothing when she left.
Just normal, like he had said, left, she, took her duffel bag. She would change her clothes because who wants to wear that uncomfortable, not cute uniform?
Yeah, I've done waitressing. Nobody wants those uniforms.
Nope, absolutely not.
So you had mentioned that you offered her a ride to the bus.
There was a bus stop right in Shoppers World of Framingham.
Yeah.
And I could have driven her down, but she said no.
So what is your whole feelings on the thumbing? We
all did it. It was the 70s. Everybody did it. I'd done it. Hell, when we got to the vineyard, my mother would do it. It didn't seem to be an issue back then. Right now, if I caught my daughter doing that, I would be horrified. And you don't see it very often anymore.
Right. Almost ever. People will call the cops on you if they see you doing it.
Right, for good reason. You just don't know who you're getting in with or who you're picking up.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But we didn't. She was 17. You don't think that way at 17.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You just think you're invincible and,
Exactly. Yeah. And it was done everywhere. All our friends did it. My husband's done it because he remembers seeing his mother coming and diving into a bush. So when he was a teenager, it was a whole different era back then. It felt safer.
So back to Simone's shift at the Rainbow Restaurant that Friday the 2nd. The diner itself was just your typical breakfast place, located in a quaint corner spot on South Main Street in Natick. It was only open for breakfast and lunch, so Simone would be closing up shop around 2 or 2:30 that afternoon. Before she left the restaurant to begin her long journey to Hyannis, she changed out of her uncomfortable waitressing uniform into something more comfortable and more herself. And I gotta say, Simone had a super cool sense of style. She would wear your typical 70s getup, and she specifically loved to wear tons of jewelry. You'd always catch her in silver and turquoise jewelry and spoon rings, which she pretty much wore on every finger, and honestly, she rocked her effortlessly cool girl sense of style. But anyway, Simone changed out of the ugly and uncomfortable dark blue polyester skirt and vest top, which, mind you, all the waitresses at the Rainbow Restaurant hated, threw it in her duffel bag, and stepped out onto South Main Street. From what I understand, as soon as Simone left the restaurant that day, she was seen attempting to hitchhike the second she walked out the door. Just based on that, it seems like the plan was to thumb right after work to get to the ferry that evening and to be in Martha's Vineyard that same day. However, that's not what happened. Simone never made it to Martha's Vineyard for Labor Day weekend, but her absence wasn't completely out of the ordinary. As I mentioned previously, she'd been described as a free spirit, the type of girl that would go her own way and do what she wanted in the moment. The type of person that would skip out on plans if she came across something she'd rather do instead. So when she didn't show up on the vineyard that weekend, her mom didn't think much of it. And because Betsy wasn't planning to visit the beach house for Labor Day, she didn't expect to see Simone either, as she wouldn't have been in town. But early the next week, from what I can tell, sometime between September 4th and the 6th, Jane arrived home from her weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, and since Simone hadn't arrived to the beach house, she expected to see her in either Sherborn or at her apartment in Framingham. And based on what's been reported or directly told to us by detectives, it's believed that Jane attempted to check out Simone's apartment in Framingham. When she was unable to find her there, Jane then called Betsy to see if she'd seen Simone. We asked Betsy what that whole ordeal was like and how she felt when she got that phone call.
How long did it take to realize, maybe something's off here?
Well, I thought she was at the vineyard, so there's 3-4 days right there.
Mm-hmm.
That I wouldn't notice because, I figure she's where she was.
Mm-hmm.
Our mom wouldn't have noticed because she probably thought she didn't make the ferry or saw someone on the way because, if you don't get to the ferry on time, you're stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't have reservations, walk on. So, who knows?
Yep.
Never occurred to her till she got home. And I honestly don't remember at this point when she came home, if she came home Labor Day or afterwards, then tried to get Simone. And then I remember her calling me.
Mm-hmm.
Said, have you seen her? Have you heard from her? I said, no, she's with you. And she said, no, she's not. And that's when she went down and we started looking. She didn't stay away great lengths of time without notifying someone.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you had to wait a couple days for her to call, but, she'd have called by now.
At that point is when the worry kicked in for Simone's family. Sure, it wasn't totally out of the ordinary for her to find something more enjoyable to do, and maybe she ditched some plans before, but the one common thing that everyone has said is that Simone would never not call if she'd found other plans. She always alerted her loved ones at least within a few days of where she was. But now, because it had been so long without any contact from Simone, this is when Jane decided to report her daughter missing. Now, unfortunately, there has been some confusion regarding the original police report and what took place once Jane went to the Sherborn Police Department to report Simone missing. Based on our conversations with Detective Godinho and Detective Haswell, Jane more than likely arrived at the station to report her missing right after Labor Day weekend. But somehow things got mixed up, and the official missing persons report wasn't filed by authorities until September 11th, which, when you do the math, was already 9 days after the last time Simone had been seen when she left the Rainbow restaurant on the afternoon of Friday, September 2nd. Unfortunately, mishaps and confusion would become a common occurrence in the early days of this investigation. And for roughly the entire first month, not much was done in terms of looking for Simone. Sure, it was 1977. Runaways were common. Authorities usually figured kids would just come back home. I mean, how many times are we going to talk about that on this podcast? But it seems like that may have been the reason for the delay in Simone's case. However, Betsy told us that Jane, Simone and Betsy's mom, was what she described as a, quote, force of nature, and she was going to attempt to find her daughter without the help of authorities. She was the type of woman who you couldn't stop from doing what she wanted, and now, knowing that, I feel like that's probably where Simone's personality came from. But either way, Jane went ahead with her own investigation, as did Simone's father, John. Betsy described some of the ways they searched for Simone.
So Jane was a force of nature, okay? Stay out of her way. Mm-hmm. She's coming and she's going to take care of this, and you basically did what she told you. I don't know where she went after the police. She probably went to the apartment first, obviously, and probably checked with work. Mm-hmm. Called me. And then beyond that, she took over. And I remember getting a call. This guy took pictures of her. You're going to go get the negatives. Okay, fine. Don't know who this person is, So she sent me to get pictures. And it was really just do what she says at that point. And remember, no cell phones, no Amber Alerts. No, nothing like today at all. Media sees a 17-year-old missing and she's got to be a runaway.
Yep.
Right.
Even though she lived on her own, really, why?
Right.
Exactly.
And so we were all kind of on our own trying to figure out what to do. Mm-hmm. It was posters. Some friends had told me there were some places she'd like to hang out in Framingham. I went and checked all those places out, which don't even exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And nobody'd seen her. We're just checking with all her friends and so forth. And, what do you do?
We were also curious regarding Betsy's opinion on the initial investigation, and it seems like we were both of the same mindset with that. Do you feel like the police didn't take it as seriously as they should have?
No, at the time, I don't think they did. Currently, absolutely.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, he's all over there. Definitely. But at the time, no, I don't think so. Because I've seen the report. It's not as big as you would think, and Sherborn's a little town. It's not like a lot goes on.
Yeah.
But no, at the time, I don't think it was handled very well.
Now, regarding the slowness of the investigation, at least within that first month, it seemed as though there was some confusion. There's that word again. Among different agencies when it came to who would have jurisdiction over Simone's case. If I had to guess, this is likely the reason why it took authorities so long to get moving. But either way, by October 4th, over a month since Simone was last seen, Sherborn Police began looking into her disappearance, and it appeared as though they took the lead in the investigation. As authorities began gathering leads during their search for Simone, they started sending out flyers to other local departments to see if maybe any other agencies had information. Then, at some point, and it's not exactly clear when, detectives went to the Rainbow restaurant. Yet another unclear aspect to this piece of the investigation is regarding what their plan was when going there, because years down the line, it's discovered that authorities never spoke to any of the employees working there during this time. The only reason we could think of when we discussed this aspect of the case with the current detectives is that maybe authorities didn't document any of the discussions they may have had. However, based on conversations later had with said employees, it appears as though there were, in fact, no interviews conducted. So, at this point in the investigation, pretty much right after it had begun, there were practically no leads to go off of, no witnesses coming forward stating that they'd seen Simone, and nothing for police to really even work with. It's been stated that they did visit local pawn shops in an attempt to locate any jewelry that looked like something Simone may have worn in hopes of linking them to her. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like anything came of this. At some point early on, authorities also went to go visit Simone's on-again, off-again boyfriend who had booked a stay at the Billerica House of Corrections. It's reported that Simone had actually had a special visit scheduled with this guy for the same day authorities went to see him, but she never showed. This boyfriend/ex-boyfriend told authorities that Simone had stopped writing to him and he was worried about her. Current detectives have spoken with this guy and confirmed his prior statement. Detectives believe that since he was in prison, there was really no way he could have done anything to Simone, and overall, he seemed genuinely upset and curious about whatever happened to her. And from this point, based on the information we've gathered, Simone's case stalled out before it could really even get going. As police's investigation dwindled to practically nothing, so did Jane's. After hiring a private investigator and psychics, she still hadn't learned anything that led her closer to finding her daughter. Nearly a decade would go by before a shocking development landed itself in detectives' laps. 9 years later, in 1986, an elderly gentleman came into the Sherborn police station to provide a statement regarding Simone Ridinger. This whole scenario, he tells police, is pretty wild, so buckle up for this part. So, sometime in 1986, this 79-year-old man told authorities that in 1977, when he was 70 years old, he was sure that he gave a ride to a young woman that he believed to be Simone Ridinger. The day prior to him coming into the station, he'd seen an article regarding Simone's disappearance and was struck by her photo. So much so that he felt compelled to tell authorities about this alleged ride. This man, who I'm going to call Mr. 86, being that he's never been publicly named, told the officer that took his statement that he was driving along Route 128 in Westwood, Massachusetts around 6:45 a.m. on September 3rd, 1977, which, if you remember the timeline so far, is the day after Simone left work at the Rainbow Restaurant and had immediately started thumbing. So, right off the bat, I'm a little suspicious because shouldn't she have already been in Martha's Vineyard by then? But let's not dwell on that now. We'll keep going. So, Mr. 86 then supposedly got pulled over by a state trooper near the intersection of Route 128 and Route 109. When the officer approached the driver's side window, he asked Mr. 86 where he was headed. He responded that he was on a trip towards the Cape, specifically to Osterville, which is a village located in Barnstable, a town on Cape Cod. He told the officer that he was traveling to pick up clock parts for one of his hobbies. He then proceeded to explain that this state trooper asked him if he'd take a girl, which he had in the back of his cruiser, to the Cape with him. And who was this girl? Well, Simone, of course. Supposedly, this trooper had her in the back of his cruiser, and after Mr. 86 agreed to take her, the trooper let her out to get into the car with this elderly man who had just gotten pulled over for a traffic violation. I already have a million questions about this whole situation, but the first that comes to mind is, why in the actual hell would a state trooper ever do something like this? But regardless of that, Mr. 86 said that after he took Simone into his car, the two chatted a bit, and then he drove her to Hyannis, which we know was her original destination. This guy then told detectives that he dropped Simone off right in front of the Hyannis Rotary Club, and after the two parted ways, he never saw her again. While authorities were speaking with Mr. 86, they asked him if he was certain that the woman in his story was Simone. He said he was positive it was her and went on to give authorities a description of the young woman he drove to the Cape. He stated that the woman had curly brown hair, was around 5 foot 7 inches tall, 135 pounds, wearing a blue shirt, blue jeans with rips in them, dirty white high-top sneakers, quote, gaudy jewelry, and he explained that she was carrying a gray duffel bag. At first glance, the only thing that seemed to be slightly off on this description was her height and weight. Simone was a bit shorter and slimmer, but the difference is practically negligible. However, at this point in the investigation, in 1986, authorities were unsure of what Simone had been wearing when she left the Rainbow Restaurant. But regardless of that, detectives showed Mr. 86 a photo of Simone to ensure that the woman he was claiming to have given a ride to was indeed the missing girl. And once again, Mr. 86 confirmed it was definitely her. Detective Godinho let us know that authorities working the case in 1986 had taken very detailed notes regarding the interaction they had with this man, but outside of that, no follow-up was done and no further leads came of this tip. And from what I understand, no one else had corroborated this guy's story, nor were there any verified sightings of Simone at the Rotary in Hyannis where Mr. 86 said he dropped her off. And unfortunately, yet again, Simone's case would go cold until Detective Godinho took it over. It appears as though sometime around 2014, Betsy was interested in what was going on with her sister's case and decided to head into the station to see if there were any recent developments. At the time, Betsy would speak with an officer regarding the case who stated they would familiarize themselves with it and get back in touch with her ASAP so they could discuss it further. It would turn out that officer was actually Detective Godinho. And for the first time in decades, the case finally had some renewed attention and had a detective assigned that was going to do all he could to get to the bottom of what happened to Simone. As Detective Godinho began looking into Simone's case, he's gone down many avenues to try and figure out what took place Labor Day weekend in 1977. There were several things we wanted to discuss with Detective Godinho and Detective Haswell when it came to the initial investigation, the steps taken and not taken, and what kind of information they had back from 77 that was useful to them now. One of the first things we talked about was Simone's apartment and if and when Jane went there to look for her.
We believe Jane Barrett, the biological mother, went to the apartment. This is through a conversation with Jane's boyfriend at the time. Mr. Ridinger and her went their separate ways prior to the disappearance and all that. And she was seeing this gentleman from Sherborn, and he actually had gone to the vineyard with her that weekend. Upon returning, Miss Barrett went to Simone's apartment. We believe that to be the case. We're not 100% on that, but we believe she went there allegedly. I don't know if you saw this article, Brittany, but there is an article out there that notes finding a note on the door. We don't have that note. We don't have a copy of that note. It's just a news article reference. But it does sound like there was some attention to the apartment by at least the family, and the police were notified. We don't have anything showing that there was a processing of the house or the apartment or collection.
We have no idea where her belongings went, if anybody was going to clean that place out, or who did clean it out.
Right. There's nothing noted from a police report standpoint.
I mean, that's a little loose end on our part. We've got a little more to do on that, and there's people that are still with us today that we need to speak to regarding that whole apartment aspect.
I think knowing what that note may have said could be very important, and the fact that no one knows where any of her belongings went seems pretty strange. I also asked the detectives if they believe Simone had gone home the night of September 2nd, to which they stated that they don't believe she did. But then that makes me question the info from Mr. 86. If his story is true and he did cross paths with her on the morning of September 3rd, then where could she have been for the entire afternoon and night of the 2nd? Did she find something more exciting to do that night and instead chose to hitchhike to the Cape the next morning? Did she get herself into trouble the night of the 2nd and that's why she was in the state trooper's cruiser? This is all just speculation, but if we're to believe Mr. 86's story is factual, then we need to try and line it up with other information we come across. In order for Detective Godinho to gather more information about Simone's case, he set his sights on the Rainbow Restaurant and Simone's co-workers from back in 77. With so much time having passed and no knowledge of where these people may be now, he put out a plea to the public, hoping to get in contact with any of these employees, and thankfully, he was able to catch a lucky break. Several of the waitresses came forward and spoke with Godinho regarding what they remembered from back then. At first glance, some people might be shocked by the information these women were able to recall, but Godinho assured us that he, along with Detective Haswell, felt confident in what the waitresses had to say. I mean, you'd have to think, if someone you knew vanished into thin air, you'd probably go over that day in your head over and over again. So it kind of does make sense that they would remember what happened so vividly. But anyway, what detectives were able to uncover from these waitresses was uncanny. He told us about one of the discussions he had with the waitresses and how they were able to describe what Simone had been last seen wearing when she walked out of the restaurant that Friday afternoon. They described her attire as a white t-shirt, blue jeans with rips in them, white high-top sneakers, and a gray duffel bag slung over her shoulder. To those of you listening, based on what we've already told you, these statements from the waitresses probably have you making a connection in your head. But for Detective Godinho, Mr. 86's story wasn't at the forefront of his mind until he re-reviewed that old interview. The fact that the description given by Mr. 86 almost identically matched everything that the waitresses told him stopped Godinho in his tracks. Sure, we can understand why the waitresses may have known what Simone was wearing that day, because they were working with her. But what are the odds of Mr. 86 knowing that, unless at least some of his story was true? After all, this characterization of what Simone was wearing had never been put out publicly by authorities, so there's no way either the waitresses or Mr. 86's memories could have been tainted by public information. So then that leaves us with the task of deciphering what pieces of Mr. 86's story may have been true. The fact that the two descriptions of Simone, given from two different sources that may have never even known each other, sure make it seem like Mr. 86 at least came in contact with Simone at some point. But the questions that need to be sussed out are when and why. Did a state trooper really just hand her off to this guy after having her in the back of his cruiser? Or could Mr. 86 have picked her up in a totally different location while she was thumbing? Maybe even right as she was leaving work? If she was still wearing the same clothes she'd left the Rainbow Restaurant in, it's probably accurate that she didn't go home after work. Then, if nobody ever came forward to verify that they saw Simone at the Hyannis Rotary Club, where she was supposedly dropped off, how can we prove that this wasn't some type of fabrication? At first, before we had even spoken to Detectives Godinho and Haswell, I had a feeling that what Mr. 86 was saying could have been shrouded by an air of ambiguity. We've said it before, where people come forward to give a story that's close to the truth while leaving out or changing other key details in order to avoid implicating themselves in something potentially more nefarious.
His story has a lot of very credible pieces of information. One theory on this is, did this guy do what he says and this was Simone and dropped her off? Is this guy coming in trying to get something off his chest, saying he did something, and maybe he did something else? It's just completely making it up. There's so many different things.
Or putting it out there to protect somebody else.
There was one other weird thing about the statement made by Mr. 86 that stood out to us.
Now, he also talked about a conversation that he had with this girl, and he had mentioned he was from Framingham. She said she was from the next town over, which all, jives with Sherborn. She used a nickname that was noted by him to be the name Sissy, which according to conversations we had with anyone who knows Simone, is not used or ever went by. But that could be, just something she threw out to this stranger.
Let's break all of this down a little bit. Like what we were just questioning, the whole scenario with the state trooper has never been verified. Detectives have looked into it and have been unable to find any reports or tickets written for this alleged traffic stop reported by Mr. 86. Sure, it was 77 and record keeping for police departments was probably not as detailed as it is today, but you'd have to think, in what world would a trooper just pass off this girl from the back of his cruiser to some random guy they've never met before? I said it before and I'm saying it again. It's weird. I'm also wondering why Simone would have ever been picked up by a cop in the first place. Without any verification of this motor vehicle stop or documentation that Simone had been in this trooper's cruiser, you have to question whether or not Mr. 86 had just made up this part of the story. But for what reason? Maybe to make it seem like an officer of the law trusted him and give credibility to his story? Rather than coming forward to say that he just picked up Simone while she was hitchhiking, only for her to later go missing. Even though Mr. 86 provided a description of Simone that was eerily similar to the one given by her coworkers, none of the other aspects of his story have been corroborated. And the biggest problem with his story is the fact that he's no longer living. He passed away before current detectives working the case ever had a chance to speak with him. However, Godinho has had a chance to speak with his son, who said his father never mentioned anything to him about this whole scenario with Simone. It would appear that, if ever possible, detectives would like to verify this guy's story, but due to the factors of time, Godinho and Haswell have had some difficulties in doing so.
We've tried to turn over every stone, but everything is either not supporting this story or we're unable to verify it. But I will say I was able to track down his son, because obviously this guy's no longer around, but I did speak with his son in hopes that he might have been shared this story, as it's kind of a unique thing that maybe you'd tell your family. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to offer anything and didn't recall his father sharing the story with him. But it's kind of a frustrating piece of information because it, in some sense, it jives shockingly consistent with a description we have from waitresses. But at the same time, we're unable to verify it, and it seems a bit outlandish. John, I don't know, you can speak to maybe...
Yeah, I mean, the story gets a little tough for us to verify, and that's what leads us in so many other directions.
As we continued chatting about Mr. 86, Detective Haswell chimed in with something important.
And, whether she thumbed or she started to thumb and got picked up by somebody locally, I don't know, but you have to remember the dynamics of our towns. We were totally different. Our town was, probably 15 to 17,000 people. Everybody knew each other. It wasn't transit. If you moved here from another town, everybody would know who you are. You'd really be an outcaster to the home environment. And to Sherborn is basically still a pretty predominant farming town. Had a couple of big farms that supported some of the local restaurants or local farm stands. It's a totally different time. So to think that if she walked out the door and started thumbing, that she more than likely got picked up by somebody that she was maybe familiar with.
So then maybe this whole story given by Mr. 86 wasn't true? Maybe he mixed up the girl he picked up with someone else? But that just doesn't seem likely. I think there are multiple scenarios that could have taken place there, but the craziest thing of all to me is the fact that Betsy never even knew about Mr. 86 until she became involved in the current investigation. It seems as though Jane had been the main point of contact for Simone's case until she passed away, and after that, there was a lapse in communication between investigators and the Ridinger family. It just seems like there wasn't much done until 1986 when that guy came forward saying he had dropped Simone off.
Right.
What are your feelings and thoughts on that whole scenario?
Well, I wish he had come forward sooner.
Yeah, it's a long time.
I mean, and he's no longer with us, so we can't really confirm anything.
Yeah.
Were there any opinions formulated about this guy and his story between you and your family?
No, not really, no. I mean, I'm trying to think of that before or after Jane passed away that came forward, because she would have had something to say, but she wouldn't necessarily have told me, because she was at that point living down in a sonnet and part of the year in Bahamas. So, we didn't see each other a lot. I mean, I just hear about these things secondhand and years down the road. It wasn't till I, stopped and I just decided one day, I said, I've got to go in. Nobody's said anything to me for years because, she was gone, my dad was gone, and nobody had contacted me about anything. So I just stopped at the police station and said, anything going on with this? And now I'm getting the information, years later.
So did you not know about the guy in 86 until way later? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Because, I wasn't the contact on it. If Jane was still around, they would have told her. She was who they spoke to if they were going to tell anybody anything.
Like Detective Haswell said, it does seem more likely that she got into a car with someone she knew, or at the very least was somewhat familiar with. So then that kind of leads us into another theory of who could have picked Simone up or what may have happened to her after she left work that day. During our conversation with Betsy, she'd mentioned to us briefly that she'd picked up photos of Simone from a photographer. And when I first began researching this case, I had seen information about this guy, the one she picked up these photos from, which struck me as odd. So basically, at some point before Simone went missing, she somehow met this photographer. He'd taken some photos of her at an unknown location, and then when she went missing and information about her disappearance was in the local news, he and Jane somehow came in contact with each other, and he went on to tell her about the photographs he had taken of Simone. Sometime after learning of the photographs, Betsy had gone to pick up the negatives from this guy back in '77. Those photos are some of the most widely known and recognized ones in Simone's case. She looks beautiful in them, in her long, checkered purple and red maxi skirt, black tank top, and Western-style boots. You can see all of her rings and jewelry in these photos, and it looks like they may have been taken in some sort of field near a body of water. Based on our conversation with the detectives, it seems as though no one has nailed down the exact location where those photos were taken, at least not yet. But from the start, and certainly before we chatted with Godinho and Haswell, John and I were a little leery about this photographer and the circumstances surrounding his connection to Simone's case.
Yeah, I mean, we believe that to be accurate and true. This gentleman, took photographs of Simone, we believe not long before she went missing, which is odd.
So weird.
We spoke with Betsy about this individual. She recalled actually going by the residence after she went missing to collect photographs of Simone. So, yeah.
We also have somebody else that said that they took them too, so that's kind of weird too. But those pictures are very provocative, for that day, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, I find those pictures a little odd too.
Yeah, there's not a lot, since reviewing the case. He was just referenced by merely name in the old documents and a misspelled version of his name at that. I have since positively identified that individual and, interesting character, that's for sure. Would be a phenomenal witness. I unfortunately, I don't think that person's with us any longer as well, would be a common theme. But, so I'll say that, honestly, I think that maybe there's a lot more work to be done on him on the case. I don't think we've put a ton of energy and resources into him.
Well, I think this 86 guy kind of makes you, do a double take. And you're like, hold on, let's look at him first. And then maybe this guy got put in the back burner.
Right. And there's a lot of other people that have popped up, and he's another potential witness, just like this other guy that came in and told the story. He's a person that we would love to be able to extract more information from. I don't think it's a possibility, unfortunately, from him directly.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a copy of some photographs that we believe are ones that he took. I don't know. I don't know if there's a lot to say about him at this point in time, outside of the fact that it appears he took some photographs of her not long before she went missing. The location of where those photos were taken, we're not certain of. It appears there's a body of water in the background of a series of some of the photographs.
Mm-hmm.
It gets our head spinning quite a bit, the gears turning. It's interesting. It's kind of concerning in some sense as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think there's more work that needs to be done on that piece of the puzzle.
This whole discussion then kind of led us into another theory that detectives have been working in, that this whole thing may have been a terrible accident. Whether that be something that happened while Simone was with friends, the photographer, Mr. 86, or someone else entirely that hasn't even been mentioned, discussed, or is even known to police thus far. We kind of went into that a bit more and talked about these ideas.
So when we started, you kind of alluded to the fact that, this very well could have been an accident and people just didn't do the right thing at the time. But then we have these, interesting characters that kind of bring themselves into this investigation that could lead you in the other direction, that something more nefarious happened.
Right. I mean, I would say that, we believe she got picked up. She never returned clearly, which leads us to believe there's foul play, most likely. But it just as well could have been she got picked up by a friend or a person she knew well. They decided to hang out, go out to a party, who knows, what have you, and something accidental happened. And instead of doing the right thing, they panicked or chose to do the wrong thing and try and get out of there or cover it up or discard, a body.
Right.
There's so many scenarios that could have unfolded. But
I don't think it was planned, though, as we all say. I don't think the whole thing was a planned activity. And
right, yeah.
That's what Detective Godinho is trying to put forward. This is truly, and we truly feel that was the person who was involved in this. It's not somebody who planned it. It was something happened as a result of something they were doing.
Right. So I guess there's just a lot of different theories that we have on what could have happened. the most generic is she was hitchhiking, picked up, and was murdered. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. She was hitchhiking, got picked up by a friend she knows, and they went somewhere and an accident happened. Whether it was in at a party or privately between those two, something happened, and instead of doing the right thing, they didn't. Mm-hmm. And she's no longer with us because of that. We certainly do not believe she left on her own accord and is living a different life now.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Just to make certain of that, there was some research done into her personal information to kind of confirm that is not a possibility. She was 17, unless she's a master of changing her identity, likely wouldn't have had much success in doing so, and there would at least be some type of a trail, whether it was through tax records, work, employment, Social Security information. So I did some research into that to confirm that almost certainly is not the case. There has been no activity of any kind whatsoever on her Social Security information since 1977. So that kind of pretty much eliminates that.
As you can tell, there are still a lot of unknowns in Simone's case. But what has been made abundantly clear is that the work detectives are putting in is revolving around the idea that this case has now become a recovery mission, and not necessarily one which they're trying to prosecute the person responsible for Simone's disappearance. They are looking to find Simone and lay her to rest properly. She deserves that. Betsy and her family deserve that.
I get it. Maybe, people didn't know originally, or they were afraid to come forward, anybody that knew something.
Yep.
But it's been long enough now, I mean, if you knew something and you're hiding it, I think, you're beyond prosecution at this point.
Yeah.
Just say something. Anything. That's really all we need. I mean, my family missed out on a lot. She missed out on a lot.
Mm-hmm.
My kids would have loved to have known her their aunt, but they didn't get to. They know about her through me, but that's about it.
Clearly, there are multiple scenarios that could have taken place in Simone's case. But putting all of them aside, more than anything, her family and detectives just want to bring her home.
With all the work we've done, we still believe there's somebody out there that knows where she was put that weekend.
I mean, I think that's just it. The goal is to find her. The goal is to put her to rest, bring closure to the family. One thing I will say is, we do need the public's help. And we're, certainly don't have an ego on this case. And if anyone's able to help us solve this case, that would be something that we'd be greatly appreciative of, obviously. And it's a team effort. No matter what happens, we're all ears. We're willing to listen. And we're hopeful that the public will help us figure this out.
If you know anything about what happened to Simone Ridinger, please contact Detective James Godinho at 508-653-2424 or Detective Haswell at 508-647-9500. Remember, you can always remain anonymous. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.